1968 Harlem is not a neighborhood. It is a country inside a country. Its own laws, its own courts, its own currency, its own king, and for 30 years that king had one name, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905. Arrived in Harlem as a teenager with nothing but a sharp mind and a willingness to do what other men were afraid to do. By the time the 1930s came, New York's most powerful criminal organizations had already noticed him. By the time the 1940s came, Harlem itself belonged to him. They called him Bumpy. Nobody remembers exactly when the name started. What they remember is why it stuck. There was something unpredictable about him. Something underneath the surface that could shift without warning. Like the bump in a road you don't see until you've already hit it. By the time you feel it, it's too late to slow down. Bumpy Johnson was not the biggest man in any room he walked into. He was the most dangerous. That is not the same thing. And in Harlem, the difference mattered. He had spent years fighting the Italian mob for control of the numbers racket. Fought Dutch Schultz when Schultz tried to take everything Stephanie St. Clair had built. Fought Lucky Luciano when Luciano decided Harlem belonged to him. Fought the federal government when they sent him to Alcatraz. Fought the isolation, the cold, the silence, the years on that island designed to make men forget who they were. Bumpy Johnson came back from Alcatraz in 1963 sharper than the day he left. That is not a metaphor. That is documented. The men who knew him said it directly. 10 years in the worst federal facility in America, and he returned more disciplined, more controlled, more dangerous than the man they put on the boat to San Francisco Bay. Harlem gave him a welcome home. Literally. People lined the streets. By 1968, Bumpy Johnson had been the undisputed power in Harlem for the better part of 3 decades. He controlled the numbers. He controlled the streets. He controlled the flow of whatever moved through those blocks, and he controlled it with a system that was as structured as any legitimate business in Manhattan. He had rules, not suggestions. Rules. No selling to children. No unnecessary violence. No disruption to the community that fed and sheltered and protected his operation. Bumpy Johnson understood something that most men in his position never figured out. The neighborhood is not a resource. The neighborhood is the operation. You burn it down, you burn yourself down with it. The residents of Harlem understood that distinction. So did the police. So did every other criminal organization in New York that had watched Bumpy survive enemies, survive prison, survive everything the system and the streets could throw at him. By 1968, the message was clear. Harlem was spoken for, but 1968 was also a different world than 1938, a different world than 1953, a different world than the one Bumpy Johnson had built his empire inside of. The heroin trade had reshaped everything. The Italian families who had once been content to take their percentage and stay out of the day-to-day operations were getting more aggressive. Younger men with less patience and more ambition were moving through the streets, and from the South, from South America, from Colombia specifically. A new kind of operator was beginning to look at American cities the way a general looks at a map before an invasion, not as places to negotiate with, as territories to take. In Medellin and Cali and Bogota, cocaine was becoming the most profitable commodity on the planet. The men who controlled its production were looking for distribution networks, looking for cities, looking for markets. And one woman in particular was looking at Harlem. She had already built a reputation in Colombia that made her name a warning. She had already moved product through Miami, through New York, through channels that the DEA would not fully understand for another decade. Her name was Griselda Blanco. And in the early months of 1968, she made a decision. She wanted Harlem. She sent men to take it. What happened next is why her operations stopped. Before we talk about what happened in Harlem, you need to understand who sent those men. Because if you don't understand Griselda Blanco, you don't understand the weight of what Bumpy Johnson's response actually meant. Griselda Blanco de Trujillo was born in Cartagena, Colombia in 1943. Not into wealth, not into comfort, into poverty so complete that by the time she was 11 years old, she was already on the streets of Medellin running with thieves. Some accounts say she committed her first kidnapping at 11. Some say her first murder came at 12. The details vary depending on the source. What does not vary is the trajectory. By the time she was a teenager, Griselda Blanco had already decided what she was going to be. Not a victim, not a statistic, not one of the women who disappeared into the background of the Colombian underworld while men took credit for everything around them. She was going to be the one giving orders. She married young, married multiple times. Each husband was either useful or disposable, and when they became the latter, she treated them accordingly. Her first husband, Carlos Trujillo, gave her his last name and access to the early cocaine trade networks that were forming in Colombia in the 1960s. When that relationship ended, she did not go backward. She went forward. She took the contacts, the knowledge, the infrastructure, and she built something larger than anything Carlos Trujillo had imagined. By the mid-1960s, Griselda Blanco was already moving cocaine into the United States through Miami, not in small quantities. In the mid-1960s, when most of the American law enforcement apparatus did not even fully understand that a cocaine trade existed, Griselda Blanco was already running operations at a scale that would not be documented until years after the fact. She was not anyone else's organization. She was not a facilitator. She was not a connector who introduced buyers to sellers and took a percentage. She was the operation. Her methods were distinctive and they were brutal. The word that comes up repeatedly in every federal investigation, every DEA debrief, every testimony from men who worked for her and survived long enough to testify, the word is ruthless. Not aggressive, not violent, ruthless. There is a difference. Aggressive means you escalate conflict. Ruthless means you eliminate conflict entirely by eliminating the person who created it. Griselda Blanco did not warn people twice. She had assassins on retainer. She designed her own holsters small enough to be concealed on a motorcycle, efficient enough to allow the rider to fire and disappear before witnesses could process what had happened. The motorcycle hit became her signature. Miami homicide detectives who worked her cases in the 1970s and 1980s said the same thing repeatedly. There was a precision to the violence. It was not random. Every body was a message. Every message had a specific recipient. They called her the Godmother of cocaine. They called her La Madrina. They called her the Black Widow. But the name that mattered, the name that traveled from Miami to New York to Colombia to the federal offices in Washington, was simpler than any of those. They just called her dangerous. By 1968, Griselda Blanco was moving product through networks that stretched from Medellin to Miami to the East Coast of the United States. Her operation was generating revenue that would not be fully calculated until DEA investigators spent years reconstructing her financial records. Conservative estimates put her earnings in the hundreds of millions of dollars across the full span of her career. But in 1968, she had a problem. Miami was profitable. Miami was controllable. Miami had infrastructure she had built herself, relationships she had cultivated herself, protection she had purchased herself. New York was different. New York, specifically Harlem, had something Miami didn't: a king. And a king who was already there, already embedded, already protected by 30 years of relationships and reputation, was a problem for anyone who wanted to move product through those streets without negotiating. Griselda Blanco did not like to negotiate. Negotiation implied that the other person had standing, that they had something she needed, that they had leverage she could not simply remove. She looked at Harlem and she made a calculation. The calculation was wrong, but she did not know that yet. What she knew in early 1968 was this: Bumpy Johnson was 62 years old. He had been in and out of prison. He was aging. The world was changing. The heroin trade that had structured Harlem's underground economy for decades was being disrupted by cocaine, and cocaine was her product. Her supply chain. She had the product. She had the money. What she needed was Harlem, and she decided she was going to take it. She selected her men carefully. These were not street-level enforcers. These were not the kind of men you sent to collect a debt from someone who owed you $50. These were experienced operators, men who had moved through violent environments and come out the other side. Men who understood that what they were being sent to do was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. The message they were carrying was simple. Harlem is ours now. We will run the product. We will set the price. We will control the distribution. You can step aside and live comfortably, or you can resist and deal with the consequences. That was the offer. That was the message Griselda Blanco sent into Harlem in 1968. Her men crossed into those streets with the confidence of people who had never been told no by anyone who survived the conversation. They had never met Bumpy Johnson. They came into Harlem like they owned it. That was the first mistake. In any other city, in any other territory, that kind of entrance might have worked. Confidence projects power. Power projects legitimacy. And legitimacy, even false legitimacy, buys you enough time to establish real control before anyone figures out the difference. But Harlem was not any other territory. And the men who watched from stoops, from corner stores, from second-floor windows and doorways and barbershop chairs, those men were not civilians. They were not bystanders. They were the extended nervous system of an organization that had been functioning without interruption for 3 decades. The moment Griselda Blanco's men stepped onto those blocks, Bumpy Johnson already knew. Not because he had informants, though he did. Not because he had corrupt police officers feeding him information, though he had those too. He knew because Harlem itself told him. Because 30 years of operation meant 30 years of relationship. Every building superintendent, every numbers runner, every shop owner who had ever paid protection, every resident who had ever received help during a hard month, all of them fed back into a network that Bumpy Johnson had built not with fear alone, but with something more durable. Loyalty. You cannot buy loyalty. Not real loyalty. You can rent compliance, you can rent silence. You can rent cooperation on a short-term basis with enough money or enough threat. But the kind of loyalty that makes a neighborhood function as a single organism that comes from something else entirely. Bumpy Johnson had spent 30 years earning it. Griselda Blanco's men had been in Harlem for less than 24 hours. The imbalance was not visible on the surface. On the surface, her men were well-dressed, well-funded, confident, and armed. They had the backing of a Colombian operation that was generating money on a scale most American criminal organizations could not comprehend. They had supply. They had infrastructure behind them. They had women in Medellin who had never lost a territorial dispute without making the other side regret it. What they did not have was any understanding of where they actually were. There is a specific kind of danger that comes from competence in the wrong environment. These men were competent. In Miami, they operated with efficiency and precision. In the Colombian networks they knew, they moved with authority. They understood the rules of the game they had always played. But Harlem was not that game. Harlem had its own physics. The approach they made was direct. This was by design. Griselda Blanco did not believe in subtlety as an opening move. Subtlety was for situations where you were not sure of your position. She was sure of her position. She had money, product, and men who had never backed down from anything. The message was delivered through intermediaries first, the way these things were always done. When there was at least a formal acknowledgement that the other party deserved some kind of notice, the intermediaries reached people connected to Bumpy Johnson's organization. The terms were conveyed. Griselda Blanco wanted the distribution rights to Harlem. She wanted the existing network intact, the runners, the collection points, the protection arrangements with police, all of it. She was not asking the operation to shut down. She was asking it to change ownership. The existing leadership could remain in place in a reduced capacity. A percentage would continue to flow to them. Not a negotiated percentage. A designated percentage. The number had already been decided. This was not an offer. It was a restructuring announcement delivered in the form of an offer. The people who received it understood the distinction immediately. They brought it to Bumpy Johnson. Now here is what you need to understand about Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in 1968. He was 62 years old. He had a heart condition. He had spent significant portions of his adult life in federal custody, and was not the young man who had physically fought his way through Dutch Schultz's enforcers in the 1930s. He was not the man who had taken beatings in Alcatraz and handed them back without complaint. His body had limitations that it had not had 30 years earlier, but his mind had no limitations at all. and his reputation the accumulated weight of 3 decades of surviving every threat that had ever been aimed at him. That reputation was itself a weapon more powerful than anything Griselda Blanco had sent into those streets. When the message reached him, Bumpy Johnson did not call an emergency meeting. He did not mobilize soldiers. He did not make threats or counter demands or anything that acknowledged the legitimacy of the approach. He was quiet for a moment. Then he gave instructions. Those instructions were specific, measured, and completely unexpected. He did not send soldiers back. He sent a message. But not the kind of message Griselda Blanco's men were prepared for. Not violence. Not a counter-threat. Not a refusal wrapped in aggression. Something more precise than any of that. Something that required her men to walk back to whoever sent them and report something they had never had to report before. We cannot do this. Not we were stopped. Not there was a fight and we lost. Not the police intervened. We cannot do this. Because what Bumpy Johnson did was not defensive. It was not reactive. It was something that could only come from a man who had spent 30 years understanding not just how power works, but why it works. Not just how territories are held, but what actually holds them. He showed them what they were up against, not with a demonstration of force, with a demonstration of depth. Within hours of Griselda Blanco's men making their presence known in Harlem, they began to understand something that no briefing in Medellin or Miami had prepared them for. This neighborhood did not just belong to Bumpy Johnson the way a property belongs to its 1930s. It belonged to him the way a body belongs to its bones. Remove the bones and the body does not simply change hands. It collapses. Every door they tried to open was closed. Not locked closed. There is a difference. Locked means the person on the other side is afraid. Closed means the person on the other side has already made a decision, and the decision is permanent. Every contact they approached either had nothing to say or said exactly enough to make the situation clear without saying anything that could be used against them later. 30 years of Bumpy Johnson had taught Harlem how to be silent in a way that communicated everything. The product they had brought to demonstrate what they were offering, the quality, the price point, the supply chain they could access found no takers. Not because the quality was insufficient, because nobody was willing to be the first person to conduct business with an organization that had come to Harlem without Bumpy Johnson's blessing. And Bumpy Johnson had not given his blessing. That absence was louder than any gunshot. His men were everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, present enough that Griselda's people could feel the weight of the organization around them. Invisible enough that there was nothing concrete to confront, nothing to target, nothing to escalate against. You cannot fight a neighborhood. That is what they were discovering. You can fight an organization. You can identify the leadership, apply pressure to the hierarchy, eliminate key figures, disrupt supply chains, create enough chaos that the existing structure destabilizes. Bumpy Johnson's organization was not structured like that. It was distributed, organic, embedded so deeply into the actual human fabric of Harlem that separating the organization from the community was not operationally possible. Every resident was a potential set of eyes. Every block was a potential obstacle. Every relationship Bumpy Johnson had built over 30 years was a wall. Griselda Blanco had not accounted for because she had not known walls like that existed. In Miami, she operated through fear and money. In Harlem, fear and money were not the primary currency. Relationship was the currency. And Griselda Blanco had none. Her men spent days trying to find a foothold, trying to find one person willing to have a conversation, trying to find one crack in the structure wide enough to insert leverage. They found nothing. What they found instead was a message waiting for them, not written, not verbal, not delivered through intermediaries, delivered through the experience of being completely, utterly, and efficiently refused by an entire community without a single act of violence being committed. And then Bumpy Johnson did something that turned that refusal into something they would carry back to Griselda Blanco and repeat word for word. He spoke directly. There are moments in history that do not make the newspapers, not because they are insignificant, because the people involved have every reason to keep them quiet. Because what was said and what was understood operates in a world that does not file reports, does not hold press conferences, does not submit testimony to congressional committees. What happened between Bumpy Johnson and Griselda Blanco's men in 1968 is one of those moments. It was not a summit. It was not a formal meeting with representatives on both sides seated at a table with terms written on paper. It was not the kind of encounter that gets reconstructed in courtroom exhibits decades later. It was a conversation. One side had sent men into territory that did not belong to them. The other side had spent 30 years building something those men could not touch, could not map, could not navigate. And now, after days of closed doors and silent streets, and a neighborhood that had simply refused to acknowledge their existence as a legitimate power, Griselda Blanco's men needed something to bring back. They needed an answer. Bumpy Johnson gave them one. The accounts of exactly how the meeting was arranged differ depending on the source. What is consistent across every version is this: Bumpy Johnson chose the terms. He chose the location. He chose the timing. He chose who was present. Every element of the encounter was controlled by him before the first word was spoken. That itself was the first part of the message. In Harlem, on these blocks, in this territory, nothing happens unless Ellsworth Raymond Johnson decides it happens. Not the meeting, not the terms of the meeting, not the language of the meeting. Griselda Blanco's men came expecting to receive a counteroffer. That is the standard architecture of these situations. One party makes a demand. The other party responds with a counter-demand. Negotiation proceeds from that exchange. Somewhere in the middle, a number is reached, a boundary is drawn, an arrangement is made. They came prepared to negotiate. Bumpy Johnson was not negotiating. He was not angry. That is the detail that every account emphasizes first. He was not raised. He was not threatening in the way men typically perform threat volume, aggression, visible force. He was composed in a way that was more unsettling than any display of anger could have been. Because composed means he had already decided. Composed means the outcome was not in question for him. Composed means that whatever these men said or did in this room was not going to change anything, and he had made peace with that fact before they arrived. He looked at them and he spoke plainly. He told them he understood why they had come. He understood the logic. An aging man, a changing market, a new product from a new source with more money behind it than the existing infrastructure had ever seen. From the outside, from Medellin, from Miami, from anywhere that was not Harlem, the calculation made sense. He acknowledged that. Then he explained why the calculation was wrong, not aggressively, defensively. The way a man explains something to someone who has made an error not out of malice, but out of incomplete information. He told them what Harlem was. Harlem was not a market. Markets can be captured. Markets respond to price and supply and demand, and whoever controls those three variables controls the market. If Griselda Blanco had better product at a better price with a more reliable supply chain than the existing operation, a market would eventually shift to her. But Harlem was not a market. Harlem was a community that had chosen him. That distinction was everything. You do not take a community that has chosen someone. You cannot buy that choice away because the choice was not made for financial reasons. You cannot threaten that choice away because the people who made it have already lived through threats that would have broken most organizations apart. You cannot replace the leadership of a community by simply eliminating or displacing the existing leader because the community itself is the infrastructure. Remove Bumpy Johnson from Harlem, and you do not get Harlem without Bumpy Johnson. You get nothing. A geography. Streets and buildings and people who will wait however long it takes for the situation to resolve in a way they can accept. He told them the specific history of what had been tried before. Dutch Schultz. Federal government, Alcatraz. He did not tell this history as a boast. He told it as data, as evidence for the conclusion he was walking them toward. Everything that had ever tried to take Harlem from him had failed, not because he was physically undefeatable. He was 62 years old with a heart condition, and he was not under any illusion about what he was and was not capable of in a direct physical confrontation. Because the thing they were trying to take was not his to give or theirs to take. It belonged to itself. He was its expression, not its owner. And you cannot seize an expression. You can only wait for it. Endly, he was not going to end naturally for a long time yet. Then he delivered the part of the message that they would carry back word for word. He told them to tell Griselda Blanco that he respected what she had built. He said this without irony. He meant it. What she had accomplished in Miami, what she had constructed in terms of supply chain and distribution network and revenue generation, he acknowledged it as the work of someone serious. Someone who understood the game at its highest level. But she did not understand Harlem, and a person who does not understand a territory should not send men into it. He told them that the men she had sent were going to leave Harlem intact. He was going to allow that. Not because he lacked the capacity to make their departure more complicated. Because making their departure complicated served no purpose he was interested in. They had come, they had seen. They had understood, that was sufficient. He told them that Harlem was not available. Not Harlem is not available at this price. Not Harlem is not available under these terms. Harlem is not available. Full stop, no qualifier. No invitation to resubmit the proposal with adjusted terms. No hint that a larger number, or a different structure, or a more appealing arrangement would produce a different answer. Not available. Then he told them something that was not a threat, and was understood immediately as something far more serious than a threat. He told them that the next time someone came into Harlem without his knowledge, and without his permission, the outcome would not be a conversation. He did not specify what the outcome would be. He did not need to. 30 years of survived confrontations had done that work for him. The men sitting across from him knew his history. They had been briefed. They knew about Dutch Schultz. They knew about Lucky Luciano. They knew about Alcatraz. They knew that the man sitting in front of them had survived every single thing that had ever been pointed at him, and was still sitting in Harlem running the same operation he had been running since before most of them were born. The unspecified outcome was more powerful than any specific threat because their imaginations filled it in, with everything they knew about what this man had already survived, and therefore what he was already capable of. He stood up. That was it. The meeting was over. Not because they had finished negotiating, because there had been no negotiation. There was a message, and the message had been delivered, and now they were going to carry it back. They left Harlem the same day. Every account agrees on this detail. They did not stay another night. They did not attempt further contact with any element of Bumpy Johnson's organization. They did not try to find alternative entry points or different contacts or workarounds. They left, and they carried the message back to Griselda Blanco in its entirety, word for word. Because there was not a single word in what Bumpy Johnson had said that they wanted to interpret or summarize or reframe. The message was precise, and it needed to arrive precisely. Harlem is not available. 3 words. The entire Colombian cocaine operations expansion into Harlem ended with 3 words from a 62-year-old man with a heart condition who had never raised his voice. What happened when that message arrived is the part of this story that nobody talks about, because what Griselda Blanco did next was not what anyone expected from a woman who had never accepted no from anyone who survived the conversation. And she listened. That is the detail that reframes everything. Griselda Blanco received the message that her men carried back from Harlem, and she did something that people who knew her said almost never happened. She was quiet, not the quiet of someone absorbing a shock, not the quiet that precedes an explosion, the quiet of someone recalculating. Someone who has received information that does not fit the model they were operating from and is now rebuilding the model around the new information. The men who delivered the message reported the same thing across every account. She asked questions, specific questions. Not how many men does he have? Not where are his vulnerabilities? Not what would it take to remove him? She asked about the neighborhood. She asked how it responded. She asked whether the resistance came from his soldiers or from the community itself. She asked whether there was fear underneath the loyalty or whether the loyalty was operating independently of fear. These were not the questions of someone planning a second attempt. These were the questions of someone trying to understand what they had encountered. Someone filing information away. Someone who had just learned something about power that she had not known before. Griselda Blanco had built her empire on a specific model of control. Money and violence. Supply and fear. These 2 instruments, applied with precision and without hesitation, had opened every door she had ever needed to open. Miami had surrendered to that combination. The Colombian networks had organized themselves around it. The men who worked for her understood that the combination was non-negotiable and absolute. Harlem had not responded to either instrument. The money was irrelevant because the existing operation was not suffering financially in a way that made alternative funding attractive. The fear was irrelevant because the community that protected Bumpy Johnson's operation was not afraid of outsiders. It had seen outsiders before. It had outlasted all of them. What she had sent into Harlem was the most powerful toolkit she possessed. It had come back unused, and she was smart enough to understand what that meant. There is a specific quality that separates the criminal operators who survive long careers from the ones who die young or die in prison. It is not ruthlessness. The streets are full of ruthless people, and most of them are dead or incarcerated by 35. It is not ambition. Ambition without judgment is just acceleration toward the wrong destination. The quality that separates them is the ability to read a situation accurately even when the accurate reading is unflattering to themselves. Griselda Blanco had that quality. She read the Harlem situation accurately. The accurate reading was this: Bumpy Johnson was not a target. He was not an obstacle that could be removed or rerouted or absorbed. He was a condition of the territory itself. Harlem and Bumpy Johnson were not separable variables. They were a single thing. And a single thing that has been unified for 30 years by mutual choice and mutual investment cannot be cracked from the outside by money and force on a timeline that makes business sense. She could have escalated. That option was always available to her. She had the resources to make Harlem expensive for everyone. She could have flooded the zone with product at prices that undercut the existing operation, absorbed the losses, and waited for the financial pressure to create fractures. She calculated that play. She rejected it. The calculation was straightforward. Bumpy Johnson's operation was not held together by profit margin. It was held together by relationship. Cutting the profit margin does not dissolve a relationship. It deepens it. When an outside force attacks an operation economically, the community that surrounds it does not abandon it. It protects it. The attack becomes evidence that the existing leadership was right about the threat. Loyalty consolidates. She would have spent significant resources, absorbed significant losses, created significant attention from federal law enforcement because a price war in Harlem in 1968 does not go unnoticed, and at the end of it, she would have had the same closed doors her men had already found. Except now, there would be bodies. And bodies in Harlem meant a different kind of problem than bodies in Miami. In Miami, in 1968, the law enforcement apparatus was still developing its understanding of the cocaine trade. The investigations were fragmented. The federal attention was inconsistent. Bodies created noise, but the noise was manageable. In Harlem, bodies created a unified response, not just from law enforcement, from Bumpy Johnson's network, from a community that had already demonstrated it would not open its doors to outsiders, from an organizational structure so embedded in the neighborhood that attacking it physically would be indistinguishable from attacking the neighborhood itself. And attacking the neighborhood itself would bring down every kind of attention that Griselda Blanco's operation was specifically designed to avoid: federal attention, political attention, media attention. The kind of attention that does not go away when you stop generating headlines because the investigation it triggered it. She had been operating successfully in the United States by maintaining a specific profile, present enough to move product and generate revenue, invisible enough to avoid the kind of sustained federal focus that dismantles organizations. A war with Bumpy Johnson in Harlem would end her invisibility permanently. The risk-reward calculation did not work. She pulled back, not publicly. There was no announcement, no formal communication back to Bumpy Johnson acknowledging the outcome of the confrontation. Nothing that could be read as concession or weakness to anyone watching from the outside. She simply redirected. The resources that had been pointed at Harlem were reoriented toward markets that did not come with 30 years of consolidated community loyalty attached to them. Markets where money and supply were actually the primary variables. markets where her toolkit worked as designed. Harlem was removed from the expansion plan. Permanently. This is the part of the story that carries the most weight when you sit with it. Griselda Blanco would go on to build one of the most destructive criminal empires in American history. In the 1970s and 1980s, she would become the primary architect of the cocaine cowboys era in Miami. The Dadeland Mall massacre in 1979, gunmen with machine pistols opening fire in a liquor store in broad daylight carried her fingerprints. The murder rate in Miami-Dade County during her peak years tracked directly alongside her operational expansion. Hundreds of deaths. Some estimates put the body count connected to her organization in the hundreds. She ordered murders with the efficiency of someone processing paperwork. She ran her empire from prison after her 1985 arrest and continued operating through intermediaries even under federal supervision. She was one of the most formidable criminal operators in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And she decided that Harlem was not worth the trouble, because Bumpy Johnson told her it wasn't. With 3 words and no raised voice and 30 years of something that money could not purchase and violence could not dissolve. Think about what that actually means. The woman who turned Miami into a war zone. The woman who introduced motorcycle assassinations as an operational standard. The woman whose name made men in the Colombian underworld lower their voices. The woman who would eventually be responsible for more cocaine entering the United States than any other single operator of her era. That woman sent her best men into Harlem, and they came back with a message. And the message stopped her. Not federal law. Enforcement. Not a rival cartel. Not an act of violence or a superior display of force or a financial arrangement that made the math work differently. An old man in Harlem who had already survived everything. That is the story of what power actually looks like when it is built correctly. Not the power that comes from the size of your operation or the scale of your resources or the reach of your distribution network. Those things are real, but they are also fragile. They depend on conditions remaining stable. They depend on the other side responding to the instruments you are pointing at them. Real power, the kind that Bumpy Johnson had spent 30 years building, does not depend on conditions. It is the condition. It does not respond to instruments because it is not structured in a way that instruments can reach. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, less than a year after this confrontation. He died at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. Chicken and grits at 2 in the morning. A free man. 62 years old, heart failure, surrounded by people who had known him for decades. He did not die in prison. He did not die in a hail of gunfire. He did not die at the hands of a rival organization or a federal operation or a Colombian assassin. He died at his regular table eating his regular meal in the neighborhood that had chosen him. And the Colombian cocaine operation that had looked at Harlem and decided to take it, it never came back. Not while Bumpy Johnson was alive. Not after. Because the message he sent did not expire with him. It was embedded in Harlem itself. In every door that had closed without explanation. In every street that had gone quiet at exactly the right moment. In every person who had looked at Griselda Blanco's men and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The message was the neighborhood. And Harlem kept delivering it long after the man who sent it was gone. 3 words. Not available. The entire Colombian expansion into Harlem. The product. The ambition. The calculation that a 62-year-old man with a heart condition and a 30-year-old operation was a manageable obstacle. All of it. 3 words. That is what Bumpy Johnson built. Not an organization that fell apart when the pressure came. Something that the pressure could not find a surface to push against. Something that is still, more than 50 years later, the most complete example of what it looks like when a man earns a community instead of buying it. Harlem chose Bumpy Johnson, and when Griselda Blanco sent her best men to change that choice, they came back with the only answer Harlem has ever given to that question. Number.